Dr. Julian Vane was a man running from his past. After a malpractice suit destroyed his career in London, he took the only job available, a night shift residency at St. Jude's Hospital for Chronic Care, a crumbling Victorian asylum turned long-term facility deep in the fog-drenched hills of Blackwood. The hospital was a labyrinth of peeling wallpaper, flickering fluorescent lights, and a heavy, sweet scent of antiseptic and rot. "You'll be in charge of Ward 9, the head nurse," a woman named Matron Halloway with eyes like cold marbles, told him. "It's for the patients who are between worlds, those who cannot recover, but refuse to expire." As Julian walked into Ward 9 for the first time, his skin crawled. The ward was circular, with 10 iron beds facing a central glass booth. The patients were all wrapped in heavy, yellowed bandages, their charts empty except for a single stamp: Remain. At exactly midnight, the hospital's ancient paging system crackled to life. "Dr. Vane to room 404. Dr. Vane to room 404. Julian checked his floor plan. There was no room 404. Ward 9 stopped at 400. "Must be a ghost in the wires," he muttered, trying to steady his hands. But then he heard it, a rhythmic, wet thumping coming from behind the heavy oak door of his own office. Thump, squish, thump. He opened the door. His office was empty, but his desk was covered in a thick, black fluid that looked like old blood. In the center of the desk sat an ancient, rusted surgical bone saw that hadn't been there a minute ago. Suddenly, the lights in the ward died. In the darkness, Julian heard the synchronized sound of 10 iron beds creaking as the unwanted patients all sat up at once. One voice, thin and raspy like sandpaper on bone, drifted from the dark. "Is it time for the surgery, doctor? We've been waiting 60 years for our skin." Julian's flashlight cut a frantic path through the darkness of Ward 9. The patients were upright, their bandaged heads tilted at impossible angles, tracking his movement with unseen eyes. He backed away, stumbling into the central glass booth. Inside the booth, the air was 10 degrees colder. He looked at the large observation mirror on the back wall, and his heart nearly stopped. In the reflection, the ward wasn't dark. It was bathed in a sickly, pulsating green light. More importantly, he wasn't alone in the booth. Standing behind him in the mirror was a woman in a stiff, vintage nurse's uniform, her cap pinned perfectly to her hair, but her face was a smooth, featureless surface of scar tissue. Julian spun around. The booth was empty. He looked back at the mirror. She was still there, holding a silver tray of rusted scalpels. "You're late for the rounds, doctor," a voice whispered, coming not from the room, but from the glass itself. "Who are you?" Julian gasped, his breath fogging the mirror. In the reflection, the woman moved closer. "I am Nurse Sarah. I've been on the night shift since the Great Fever of '54. We don't leave St. Jude's. We just move to the negative floor." She pointed to the floor. In the mirror, Julian saw a staircase behind him that didn't exist in the real room. "The patients in Ward 9 aren't sick, Julian," Sarah's voice grew urgent. "They are hollows. The previous doctors took too much from them. A lung here, a piece of bone there, trying to build the perfect patient. Now they are empty vessels, and they can smell how much wholeness you still have." Suddenly, a loud clack, clack, clack echoed through the ward. The patients had climbed out of their beds. They weren't walking. They were dragging themselves across the floor like broken insects, their yellowed bandages unraveling to reveal limbs that were stitched together from different bodies. One patient, a giant of a man with a metal plate bolted to his skull, reached the glass booth. He slammed a hand against the pane. The glass didn't break, but it began to turn into liquid, like melting ice. "You want your hands, doctor?" Sarah whispered in the mirror. He was a pianist before they borrowed his fingers. Julian realized the negative floor wasn't just a reflection. It was the hospital's memory, and it was starting to leak into the present. He saw the bone saw on his desk start to vibrate. "How do I stop them?" Julian yelled. "You can't," Sarah replied, her featureless face turning toward the dark hallway. "You can only give them something else to hunt. Go to the basement archives. Find the rejected charts. If you find their names, you gain their debt. But hurry, the shadow surgeon is waking up." The air in the basement was thick with the smell of stagnant water and formaldehyde. Julian waded through knee-deep, black water that felt unnaturally heavy against his legs. The flashlight in his hand flickered, struggling against the darkness that seemed to swallow light. He found himself in a room labeled pharmaceutical records, but the shelves didn't hold pills or bandages. Instead, thousands of small, hand-blown glass jars were lined up, each filled with a swirling, iridescent vapor. "Liquid memories," Julian whispered, his voice echoing off the damp stone. He approached a shelf marked volatile rejects. As Sarah had warned, the hollows upstairs were tracking his wholeness, his unique identity. To survive the walk back to the ward, he had to mask his scent. He had to become someone else. His hand drifted toward a jar filled with a dark, oily smoke. The label was stained, but the name was still legible. Patient 044, the butcher of St. Jude's. "Don't do it, doctor," a voice rasped from the corner. Julian spun his light. Sitting atop a stack of rotting ledgers was a man, or what was left of one. His jaw was missing, replaced by a rusted iron grate, and his skin was the color of bruised plums. "I am the apothecary," the creature hissed through the grate. "I've tasted every memory in this room. You want to hide from the hollows? You want to smell like one of them? Drink the butcher. But be warned, a memory that's strong doesn't just sit in your stomach. It looks for a way to use your hands." The sound of wet footsteps echoed from the stairs behind Julian. The hollows were coming down. He could hear the metal plate of the giant patient scraping against the stone walls. Scree, scree. In a moment of pure survival instinct, Julian unscrewed the jar. The oily smoke rushed out, cold and smelling of iron and winter. He didn't drink it, he inhaled it. Immediately, his vision fractured. The basement vanished. For a split second, Julian wasn't a doctor. He was standing in a rain-slicked alleyway in 1942, holding a heavy meat cleaver, watching a shadow scream. He felt a sudden, violent surge of adrenaline and a terrifying, cold hatred for the world. He looked at his hands. They were trembling, but they felt stronger, larger. "Excellent," the apothecary chuckled. "You smell like a monster now. Even the hollows fear a butcher." Julian turned toward the door as the giant patient burst into the room. The creature stopped, its head tilting as it sniffed the air. It didn't lunge. Instead, it recoiled, let out a soft, whimpering sound, and retreated back into the darkness. But Julian felt something cold moving in the back of his mind. A voice that wasn't his own whispered, "Where do we put the knives, Julian? We have work to do." Julian climbed the stairs back to Ward 9, but he didn't walk like a doctor anymore. His gait was heavy, his shoulders hunched, and his fingers twitched as if seeking the weight of a cleaver. The butcher's memory was a cold poison in his veins, making the flickering lights of the hallway look like strobe flashes of past crimes. When he reached the ward, the air was thick with a new sound, a low, rhythmic chanting. Matron Halloway stood in the center of the circular room. She was holding a ceremonial bone needle threaded with silver wire. The unwanted patients were kneeling around her in a perfect, terrifying circle. "You've changed, Dr. Vane," Halloway said without turning around. She was stitching the air itself, pulling invisible threads out of the patients' open mouths. "You smell of the basement. You smell of history. What are you doing to them?" Julian asked, his voice sounding deeper, more gravelly. "Healing is a lie," Halloway hissed. "Pain is the only thing that's real. We harvest the agony of the unwanted to keep the shadow surgeon fed. Without him, this hospital would crumble into the sea of time. And tonight, he requires a masterpiece." She pointed to an empty operating table in the center of the ward. On it lay a ghost patient, a flickering, translucent shape of a young girl. She wasn't solid, but her screams were loud and clear. "To leave this shift alive, Doctor, you must complete the stitchwork ritual," Halloway commanded. "You must sew the girl's soul into a physical body. If you fail, the shadow surgeon will use your skin as the canvas." Julian approached the table. The butcher's memory roared in his mind. "Cut her open," the voice whispered. "See what's inside the light." Julian took the silver needle from Halloway. His medical training told him to be careful, but the butcher's instinct wanted to hack and tear. As he touched the ghost patient, her cold, spectral energy surged through the needle, showing him her life. She was the daughter of a former patient, trapped here for eternity. "I won't do it." Julian gritted his teeth, fighting the urge to plunge the needle into the girl's throat. "Then he will come for you," Holloway warned. A massive shadow began to detach itself from the ceiling. It was 10 feet tall, draped in a tattered, blood-soaked lead apron. Its face was a rusted iron mask with long, needle-like protrusions. The shadow surgeon. The surgeon didn't use a scalpel. He reached out with fingers that were 3-foot-long surgical drills, spinning with a high-pitched, bone-chilling whine. The butcher's personality in Julian's head suddenly shifted from predatory to terrifying. "Not him," the butcher whimpered. "He's the one who harvested me." The high-pitched whine of a shadow surgeon's drills merged into a single, sterile hum. Suddenly, the smell of rot and old bandages vanished, replaced by the sharp, stinging scent of ozone and high-grade rubbing alcohol. Julian blinked. He was no longer in the crumbling Ward 9. He was standing in Operation Theatre 1 at St. Mary's in London. The lights were blindingly white. The heart monitor was beeping a steady, mocking rhythm. This was the night of the accident, the night he lost everything. "Scalpel, Dr. Vane," a nurse said. Her voice was flat, mechanical. Julian looked down at the patient on the table. The body was draped in green cloth, leaving only the chest exposed. But as he looked at the face, his blood turned to ice. It was himself. He was standing over his own body. In this dream logic, he was both the killer and the victim. "Don't hesitate," the butcher's voice whispered, now muffled, as if speaking through a thick wall of cotton. "If you don't cut him, the surgeon will cut us both." Julian looked up at the viewing gallery. The seats weren't filled with medical students. They were filled with the unwanted patients from Ward 9, their yellowed bandages glowing under the surgical lights. At the very top, Matron Holloway sat like a judge, her silver needle glinting. Suddenly, the heart monitor flatlined. Beep! The doors to the theater burst open. The shadow surgeon didn't walk in. He bled through the walls, his lead apron dripping black ichor onto the pristine floor. He loomed over the table, his drill fingers spinning toward Julian's own sleeping face. "This is a loop," Julian screamed. "It's not real. Pain is real." The surgeon's voice echoed, sounding like metal grinding on stone. "Regret is the ultimate anesthetic. You are trapped in the moment you failed, Julian. To wake up, you must find the exit wound." The surgeon lunged, but not at Julian the doctor. He aimed for the chest of Julian the patient. Julian realized the exit wound wasn't a physical hole. It was the truth he had been hiding from. He hadn't just made a mistake that night in London. He had been tired, arrogant, and drunk on his own success. He had let his ego kill a man. He grabbed the hand of his sleeping self. As the shadow surgeon's drill touched his skin, Julian didn't pull away. He leaned into the pain. "I am the failure," he whispered. The world shattered. The white lights of the operating room cracked like glass, revealing the dark, rotting rafters of St. Jude's behind him. The exit wound opened in the center of his own chest, a glowing, jagged tear in reality. Julian reached into the wound and pulled. He didn't pull out a heart. He pulled out a rusty key labeled Morgue Level 0. He woke up on the floor of Ward 9, gasping for air. The shadow surgeon was gone, but the ward was different. The patients were gone. The beds were empty, but the floor was covered in thousands of keys, all vibrating, all screaming his name. Julian stood alone in the center of the vacant Ward 9, the rusted key heavy and cold in his palm. The screaming of the vibrating keys on the floor slowly subsided into a rhythmic, mechanical clicking. It sounded like 1,000 watches ticking out of sync. He followed the sound to the service elevator, a cage of iron filigree that smelled of oil and old earth. He inserted the key into a slot that hadn't been there before, marked with a scratch 0. The elevator groaned, descending past the basement, past the pharmacy of memories, into a level that didn't appear on any architectural map. When the door slid open, Julian stepped into the morgue of echoes. It wasn't a room of cold drawers. It was a cathedral of brass and bone. The walls were lined with clock patients, hundreds of them, suspended in glass tubes filled with amber-colored oil. They weren't moving, but their chests were open. In place of hearts, complex clockwork gears turned with a wet, metallic grinding. Click-tick, click-tick. They're the batteries, a voice said. Julian turned to see Nurse Sarah. She looked more transparent now, her vintage uniform flickering like a dying film reel. St. Jude's doesn't run on electricity, Julian. It runs on stolen time, she whispered. Every patient who died here had their remaining years harvested. A child's lost decades, an old man's final hours. It's all wound into these gears. In the center of the room sat a massive, ornate iron sarcophagus connected to the clock patients by hundreds of rubber tubes. The tubes pulsed with a golden fluid. Who is in there? Julian asked, his hand trembling. The architect, Sarah replied. Dr. Alistair Sterling. He founded this hospital in 1888 to conquer death. He died, but he refused to leave. Matron Holloway has been keeping his consciousness alive for over a century, waiting for a whole soul to restart his physical heart. A soul like yours, Julian. Suddenly, the sarcophagus hissed. Steam, smelling of copper and ancient dust, billowed out. From the shadows, Matron Holloway appeared, holding a massive, brass winding key. She looked at Julian not with hatred, but with a terrifying, motherly hunger. The butcher's memory made you strong enough to survive the basement. Julian, she said, stepping toward him. But your guilt is the finest lubricant for the master's gears. One more turn, and the Victorian age returns to Blackwood. The sarcophagus lid began to slide open. From within, a withered, blackened hand reached out. It wasn't a hand of man, but a hand made of needles, wire, and gears. The butcher's voice in Julian's head suddenly screamed, "Run, you fool. He's not a doctor, he's a hollow god." The sarcophagus didn't just open, it exhaled. A cloud of soot and oxidized copper filled the room as Dr. Alistair Sterling rose. He was a nightmare of Victorian engineering. A skeletal frame held together by leather belts. His ribcage a rotating drum of brass cogs. His eyes were not eyes at all, but two glowing vacuum tubes that hummed with a sickly orange light. As he stood, the tubes connected to the clock patients began to retract. The patients in the glass jars withered instantly into dust, their stolen time being sucked into Sterling's massive frame. A new era requires a new pulse, Sterling's voice echoed, sounding like 100 clocks chiming at once. He raised a clawed hand toward Julian. The gears in his chest spun backward. Suddenly, Julian felt a sickening wrench in his gut. The floor beneath him seemed to stretch. He looked down at his hands and gasped. His skin was smoothing out. The scars on his knuckles from years of surgery were vanishing. His lab coat became 3 sizes too big, the sleeves hanging past his fingertips. "He's rewinding you," Sarah's voice screamed from shadows. "He's taking your years to lubricate his own heart." Julian tried to run, but his legs felt short and uncoordinated. He was physically reverting, 25, 18, 15. His voice cracked as he yelled, "Stop it!" The hospital walls began to shift. The morgue of echoes was no longer a room. It was a living puzzle. Hallways folded like paper, and doors vanished into the ceiling. Sterling moved through the chaos with terrifying grace, his mechanical limbs clicking as he stalked the now-teenage Julian. "Don't fight the cycle, boy," Sterling hissed. "In a few minutes, you'll be an infant, a blank slate of time, and then I shall consume your entire potential." Julian scrambled into a narrow crawl space, the laundry chute. The butcher's memory in his mind was fading, replaced by the terrified thoughts of his younger self. But the butcher left him one final jagged piece of advice. If he's a machine, find a pressure valve. Julian tumbled out of the chute and into the furnace room. This was the heart of the hospital's heat. Massive coal-fired boilers roared with blue flames. But these boilers weren't burning coal. They were burning the rejected charts, the papers containing the names and lives of the forgotten patients. As Julian approached the main boiler, his body hit another time skip. He was now 10 years old, his vision blurred by tears he hadn't shed in decades. He looked at the pressure gauge on the side of the boiler. It was redlining. Sterling burst through the wall, his brass frame glowing red from the heat of the room. He reached for the boy. "The end of your time is the beginning of mine," the architect loomed over him. Julian didn't run. He grabbed a heavy iron fire poker. He didn't aim for the architect. He aimed for the main steam pipe above the boiler. "You want my time?" Julian's voice was high and thin. "Take it all at once." Julian swung the iron poker with the desperate strength of a boy fighting for his very existence. The metal slammed into the rusted valve of the main steam pipe. For a heartbeat, there was a deafening silence. Then the pipe shrieked. A massive plume of high-pressure steam erupted, but it wasn't white. It was a blinding, prismatic gold. This was concentrated time, the raw energy harvested by the hospital, released all at once. The architect, Dr. Sterling, was caught in the center of the blast, a machine built to consume time slowly. He was suddenly drowned in a tidal wave of it. His brass gears began to spin so fast they turned white-hot. "Too much." Sterling's mechanical voice splintered. I see the end. I see the hospital as dust. I see the sun dying." But Julian was also caught. As the steam hit him, he felt his physical form shatter. He wasn't just a 10-year-old anymore. He became desynchronized. In the flickering gold mist, 3 versions of Julian Thorne appeared. The child, small, nimble, and fueled by pure, unadulterated fear. The resident, the current Julian holding his medical bag and his guilt. The elder, a version of Julian from a future that hadn't happened yet. Withered, wise, and dressed in a tattered doctor's gown. "We have to stop the heart," the elder Julian said, his voice a calm one. The 3 Julians moved in a terrifying, synchronized dance. The child crawled under Sterling's massive, sparking legs to trip the mechanical locks. The resident used his surgical knowledge to identify the vocal cord, wires that controlled the architect's motor functions. The elder stood back, guiding them with the knowledge of how the machine would eventually fail. Sterling lashed out, his drill fingers tearing through the air, but he was fighting 3 ghosts. He would aim for the child, only to find the resident's scalpel slicing through a rubber fuel line. He would strike at the elder, only for the child to pull a lever that dumped freezing water onto his red-hot gears. "You are a paradox," Sterling screamed, his vacuum tube eyes flickering. "You cannot exist. We exist because you stole our tomorrow," the resident Julian replied. The 3 versions of Julian converged on the architect's central chest cavity, the master gear. It was a pulsing, golden orb made of the fused wedding rings and pocket watches of 1,000 dead patients. The elder Julian placed a hand on the orb. "It's time to clock out, Doctor." With a collective heave, the 3 Julians pulled. The master gear didn't just break, it detonated. A shockwave of pure memory blasted through the furnace room. Julian felt himself being pulled back together, the child and the elder merging back into the man. The heat vanished. The golden light died. Julian fell to the floor, his body restored to his true age, but his hair was now streaked with white. Dr. Sterling sat slumped against the boiler, his brass frame hollow and silent. The architect was finally just a pile of scrap metal. But the hospital wasn't finished. As the master gear died, the foundations of St. Jude's began to groan. Without the stolen time to hold it together, the Victorian walls were aging 100 years every second. The sound of the hospital dying was like 1,000 glass cathedrals shattering at once. With the master gear gone, the stolen time holding the mortar together evaporated. Stone blocks turned to sand. Oak doors rotted into mulch in seconds. Julian scrambled out of the furnace room, his lungs burning from the dust of a century. As he sprinted toward the service elevator, he saw them, the evacuation. Thousands of gray, flickering shapes were pouring out of the walls. They were the patients whose time had been harvested, the unwanted. Without the architect to bind them, they were being discharged into the void. But they were confused, angry, and blind. They clawed at Julian as he ran, their touch leaving frost on his skin. "The exit," Julian gasped, reaching the iron cage of the elevator. He punched the button for the ground floor, but the elevator didn't move. The shaft above him was screaming. He looked up and saw Matron Holloway descending the cables like a spider, her silver needle glowing with a terrifying, oily black light. "You've broken the clock, Julian," she hissed, her voice echoing through the collapsing shaft. "But the hospital needs a foundation. If we cannot have your time, we will have your space." She landed in the cage with him, her movement blurred by the desynchronized air. In her hand, she held a syringe filled with a fluid so dark it seemed to suck the light out of the room. "The Black Anesthetic. One drop of this," Holloway whispered, "and your consciousness will expand to fill these walls. You won't be a doctor. You will be the bricks. You will be the wards. You will feel every crack in the foundation for eternity." She lunged. Julian dodged, the black needle grazing his shoulder. Immediately, his left arm went numb. Not just numb, but hollow. He looked down and saw his arm beginning to turn into gray, weathered stone. The transformation was starting. He backed out of the elevator and into the ruins of Ward 9. The circular room was now a whirlpool of debris. In the center, Nurse Sarah stood, her form nearly transparent. "Julian, the Black Anesthetic is the hospital's soul," she shouted over the roar of the collapse. "If she injects you, the building survives through you. You have to give her a different target." Holloway moved with supernatural speed, pinning Julian against a crumbling pillar. She raised the syringe, the black needle hovering inches from his eye. "Sleep now, Dr. Vane," she smiled. "Your shift is finally over." Julian felt the butcher's memory, now just a faint ember in his mind, flicker one last time. It didn't give him strength. It gave him a dark, surgical idea. He reached into his medical bag and grabbed the only thing he had left, the jar of volatile rejects from the basement, the one that had held the butcher's identity. It was empty of vapor, but it still held the essence of a murderer. As Holloway plunged the needle down, Julian didn't move his head. He smashed the glass jar against his own chest. The black needle didn't hit his skin. It hit the shards of the jar, and the black anesthetic was sucked into the vacuum of the reject glass. The reaction was instantaneous. The jar didn't break, it grew. It began to consume Holloway's hand, then her arm, drawing her into the very memory prison she had used to control the patients. "No," she screamed, her body stretching and twisting like pulled taffy as she was sucked into the glass. "I am a matron. I am the..." The jar fell to the floor, now pitch black and vibrating with Holloway's trapped rage. The ward groaned. The floor beneath Julian's feet tilted at a 45-degree angle toward the black abyss of the basement. The walls of St. Jude's were no longer solid. They were becoming a mist of gray ash and forgotten whispers. Julian sprinted toward the towering oak doors of the main entrance. Behind him, the ward collapsed into a singularity of black glass and silver wire. The weight of the hollow arm, the stone flesh where the anesthetic had grazed him, dragged him down. Every step felt like pulling a limb out of wet cement. "Jump, Julian!" Sarah's voice echoed one last time, sounding like a fading radio signal. "Don't look back." He lunged through the threshold just as the heavy doors turned into smoke. He felt a sensation of falling, not through air, but through history. He felt the cold of 1888, the fever of 1954, and the guilt of his own modern life colliding in his chest. Julian woke up face down in the cold, wet heather of the Blackwood Hills. The morning sun was a pale, sickly disk struggling through a thick blanket of fog. He groaned, pushing himself up. His left arm was no longer stone, but it was deathly pale and cold to the touch. He turned around to look at the hospital. There was nothing. No ruins. No scorched earth. Not even a foundation. There was only a perfectly circular patch of dead, blackened grass where St. Jude's ward for the unwanted had stood for over a century. It hadn't burned down. It had simply been unmade. Julian checked his pockets. The butcher's memory was gone. The heavy iron keys were gone. He was just a man in a tattered lab coat, standing in the middle of nowhere. "It's over," he whispered, his breath hitching. "I'm out." He began the long walk down the hill toward the village. He felt a strange lightness, a sense of freedom he hadn't known since before the malpractice suit. He had faced the architect of time and won. He had survived the night shift. He reached the outskirts of the village and found his car parked where he had left it. He climbed in, shivering, and looked into the rearview mirror to wipe the soot from his face. He froze. In the reflection of the mirror, he saw the back seat of his car. Sitting there, perfectly still, was the black jar, the one that had consumed Matron Holloway. It was no longer vibrating. It sat there, dark and silent, like a dormant heart. But that wasn't the worst part. When Julian looked at his own reflection, he didn't just see his face. For a split second, the eyes in the mirror didn't move when he moved. They stayed fixed on him, glowing with a faint, orange vacuum tube light, the light of Dr. Sterling. A cold realization washed over him. The hospital didn't need bricks and mortar to exist. It had found a much more mobile foundation. He reached for the car door to run, but his left arm, the pale, cold one, didn't obey him. It moved on its own, reaching for the ignition. It turned the key. The engine hummed to life, and the sound wasn't the roar of a motor, but the rhythmic mechanical click-tick of 1,000 gears. The GPS on the dashboard flickered and changed. The destination was no longer his apartment in London. The screen displayed a single line of text. Dr. Vane, you are needed in Ward 10. The patients are waiting. Julian screamed, but no sound came out. His mouth felt like it was being stitched shut from the inside. As the car pulled out onto the road, the fog didn't dissipate. It followed him, wrapping the car in a shroud of gray silk. The hospital was gone from the hills, but it was now driving into the city. And Dr. Julian Vane was no longer the doctor. He was the ambulance.